So Anand Giridharadas, it's great to have you with me today. We got a chance to talk a little bit before we started recording this conversation, and I've been a fan of yours for a while. I follow you on social media. I've read your book, Winners Take All. I think it's a really great book, but I really think that some of the ideas that you put out there, some of the thoughts that you put out in the media, some of the interviews you've done with other people, are really compelling, and you tell a really great story. So let me first thank you for being part of the show and congratulate you on all the great work that you've done in this regard.
No, thank you. It's I'm really excited to be in conversation with you and heading out to meet folks in person in the fall.
In San Diego, yeah, looking forward to having you there for sure. So as we discussed, I've been on this journey for a while. I started NARUP 22 years ago, and it was about bringing together real estate professionals, Latino real estate professionals in particular, who have a common goal to advance homeownership amongst the Latino community, but also to help build success and wealth between the real estate professionals that serve those communities and try to put some structure and some thought. And when you put together a trade association, part of the work is also around public policy and advocating for certain policies that we think align with our mission, so to speak. There's no question that there are enormous wealth gaps out there in America, and those gaps are widening. They're not getting smaller. I'm trying to find some of the solutions that we can use in terms of our policy work, our advocacy, and even to educate the real estate community that we serve, as well as the industry that we're a part of, on some of the ideas and best practices that I just think the Hispanic community will benefit from. I also believe because of demographics, because that people who look like you and me are really going to be the majority of this country in a very short period of time. These wealth gaps pose pretty substantial threats to our prosperity as a nation and to our leadership in the world economy. So my first question for you is, how did we get here? How do we get to the point to where we have such disparity in our wealth in this country?
Well, it's a great question. When you and I were talking before, I mean, I think you're talking about real estate, which is a very entrepreneurial profession, and it is a profession in some ways that defines that is kind of uniquely American in a certain way. There's a way in which that self-determination of space and a home. I mean, people want space everywhere in the world, but there's a certain way in which that kind of fantasy of space and independence and selfhood is so particularly pronounced and developed in this country. And you represent an entrepreneurial community that is engaged in that kind of entrepreneurial work. And a lot of what I write about and have been sounding the alarm about is there is a limit to what the folks who in your association and the folks that they are representing can achieve in a society that is working for fewer and fewer people every year. So we're having another real estate kind of craze in many parts of the country right now, and all this stuff of multiple bids over asking price and people buying houses sight unseen and all of that. And it seems like the good times are rolling, but there are some very ominous megatrends, as you know well. I mean, it is not clear that the rising generation of people, I'm a millennial and there's kind of Gen Z coming up behind me, for our generation, it is not clear that you're going to have any of the wealth, kind of mass wealth in terms of millions of people having the means to continue to buy property and continue to kind of live a stable, grounded life in which you can kind of have a job and establish a family and have children and buy real estate over your head. It is not clear that that's going to be an existence that is viable for a significant number of people.
I think we're already seeing that. We're seeing affordability in terms of people being able to enter the market being at an all-time high. And there's only so far that can go. The real estate industry has done well as an industry for the last couple of years, but I can see already indicators that the next flow of potential homeowners are going to have it much, much more difficult. And so give me some of the ideas that you've talked about as to why these disparities exist today. What did we do, as a society to get us here?
So, in the 1970s, one way to tell the story is that in the 1970s, there was a famous document called the Powell Memo. And the Powell Memo, not a lot of people know about it, but it's, you can find it online. It was written by Lewis Powell, who would later go on to be a Supreme Court justice, but at the time was a lawyer representing the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, business interests.
Sure.
And the Powell Memo argued that the political right and the interests of big business needed to get in bed together to resist the tide of, a kind of dangerous hippie left kind of thing. And if you go back that far, big business and evangelical Christians and the Republican Party that were not necessarily all in lockstep. There were differences among them, right? Business people and Christians, for example, often look at the world quite differently on all kinds of things, right?
Sure.
But there was an argument made that these groups need to get together, and they did get together, and they were financed by several very wealthy American families. And what grew out of that was really a profound turn in the ideology and politics of this country. And that culminated, you could say, in 1981 in Ronald Reagan coming to office and saying, government is the problem, not the solution, right? Government is the problem, not the solution.
That we hear that all the time.
You hear it now all the time, right? Not a lot of sentences that are said once in a speech become, are still ringing in your ear 40 years later, but that one is. And it kind of defined the era, has continued to define the era. And so what that sentence meant in practice was, let's just cut regulation, right? Let's get the government out of your life. You've heard that rhetoric. Let's cut taxes. Let's let people, keep their money, and big companies keep their money, and it'll trickle down. Well, Americans have been waiting for 40 years, most Americans, for the rising tide to in fact lift their boats, for the wealth to trickle down. And what instead happened was what a lot of people warned would happen, which is that a very small number of Americans would grab every year a greater and greater share of the pie, and the opportunity to move through the kind of life stages that in some ways real estate is such a part of, right? Being born, having stability over your head as a child, getting out in the world, making it on your own, having enough stability to buy a home for your family, so on and so forth, having a place to retire if you want to move when you're at that age. We have slowly eviscerated the opportunity of, 70, 80% of Americans to enjoy that kind of assured passage of life in any kind of stability. And in the same time, the billionaire class, the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Bill Gateses, they've gotten not just richer, but hoardingly richer, right? And the thing is, speaking to
These are centibillionaires now. We never had that before.
I mean, we're going to have a trillionaire before we know it, right? And they buy more and more companies, consolidate companies. Does anybody here, I mean, you're an association of entrepreneurs. Does anyone think any entrepreneur wants to compete with Facebook? Could, no matter how good the product,
No.
right? You will be bought or killed.
Right.
The company killed, I hope. Not more than that. There is, so they kind of dominate the economy, but then they get in the political arena and they buy up politicians. They buy media, so kind of try to exert control over the discourse. They use philanthropy, as I wrote about in the book, to kind of cast themselves in a different light and make people think they are the solution, when in many ways they're the problem. And when you think about what made at its best America a different place before this turn in the kind of capital worshiping turn of the Reagan era and onward, it was, we actually believed in mass affluence. We believed and pursued policies to allow tens of millions of people to live like little kings and queens.
And those specific policies, you're talking about tax policy, you're talking about deregulation, you're talking about what else? This notion that government is the problem and it needs to get out of the way. so that the market can sort of behave in a sort of unrestrained manner? I mean, are those the policies and the ideas that have kind of gotten us to this point, in your view?
Yeah, and essentially, taxes in some ways is the biggest one, because it really shapes the wealth distribution. And if you look at what happened, starting in 1981 onwards, basically the top 1%, but really like the 0.001%, basically got massive tax cuts in that year. They got it again under George W. Bush. They got it again under Donald Trump, to the point where the 400 richest families in this country now pay a lower effective tax rate than people, the regular working people.
And that doesn't seem like it obviously doesn't seem fair, but it doesn't seem like a recipe for a well-organized society. I want to talk about this tax issue a little bit here, because your point of view is compelling, but the other side of the argument. So my organization has a lot of small business owners, a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of people who are sort of working their way up the ladder, so to speak, and they feel that they're paying enough taxes, and that that increasing that is only going to make it more difficult for them to advance economically. What do you say to some of them?
How many people in your ranks are billionaires?
Zero.
So they might be okay. Look, what I am saying is actually, I'm not sitting here writing a specific tax bill, but if you look at some of the proposals in recent years that have been the most interesting, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders both had wealth tax proposals, right?
Yeah.
Pretty sure most of your members would not be affected negatively by either of those plans. Elizabeth Warren's kicked in at $50 million in assets and up, right? And the tax got larger at $1 billion in assets and up. And what would that proposal have paid for, just as an example?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Free community college and regular college.
Just that alone.
Just that, right? How many of your members are paying a ton of money for kids to go to college?
I can raise my hand on that one.
Daycare, universal daycare was included. How many of your members are paying a lot of money for childcare that in Norway or France is free?
And speaking of colleges, my daughter went to Sarah Lawrence just down the street there. She thought it was a great school. It did her well. It was also the most expensive college in the country at the time. So thank you, Marissa.
So I would say, and I'm glad you asked that, because it's a common misconception. If I were drafting these plans, but I think some of these plans that were already on offer, I don't think we should go after people who are, real estate brokers trying to do well. I don't think we should go after a guy in Queens who has one store and wants 3 stores. I don't think we should go after, people who are trying to be more successful in their professions. That's not what this is about. I don't think any of the most serious.
So your thoughts are, we got to go after the folks that are the outliers, these folks that are just hoarding, to use your word, these enormous fortunes. And that fortune is coming from somewhere, right? It doesn't come out of thin air. It comes from some other sources. I think it's one of the things that people have a difficulty understanding. But when we get it, when these things end up being policy, and this is where I kind of understand the skepticism around this, is that when it actually materializes into policy, somehow it changes. It goes from this really, I think, idea that 95% of the population supports, which is, yes, the Elon Musks and the centibillionaires, and even people that are $100 million or more should be paying more taxes too. I think anybody making more than $400,000 needs to start paying more taxes. That's how these things end up getting, and that's why I think, they don't, I don't know, politicians don't package it well, they don't sell it well, they don't, whatever. But I see within my organization these debates going on.
I think you're right, and I think it's a mistake. I think the Democratic Party should be, again, I'm not the guy who has to make the numbers work, so that's someone else's job.
No.
But I think the Democratic Party, maybe $1 million a year is like a very clear number, because people know whether or not they make $1 million, and they know whether or not they're ever going to make $1 million. Maybe, like 400,000, which is often used as a threshold. Maybe that's low, right? Maybe there's a lot of people who dream that they're gonna get to that level in America, and some people do. I think there needs to be a clearer sense than there often is right now. This is not coming for you, right? Like, and if you go back to the Warren plan, which is one plan, there was a clarity there. So let's just be, the fact that you could pay for Medicare for all, universal pre-K, and universal public college and free, right? Let's remember, it was a less than 10% tax.
Yeah.
Only on those assets above 50 million and then $1 billion. And remember, these folks earn 15-20% annual returns on their capital stock, right? So Elizabeth Warren was essentially taking away through taxation a quarter or so, let's say, of the increase. To put it another way, if you're worth $100 million, right? In a normal year, because those folks have great assets that they're having exposure to, that 100 million becomes 120 million through maybe a combination of appreciation and different things, right? 120 million.
Right.
The Warren tax would have, essentially taken away like 3 to 5 million out of that.
Right.
Right. You still have 115 million, whereas you had 100 million the year before. And through all of that clipping of your wings, we could pay for universal healthcare, universal daycare, and universal public college. And you're not poorer at the end of the second year. You're just slightly more rich.
And I think that, to your point, if we're talking about leveling playing fields, we're talking about an environment where everybody has a fighting chance. You have to start with education. You have to start with healthcare. You got to start with those basic things that give everybody, I think, a fair chance to compete and succeed in a competitive society out there. So I don't know and understand why people don't understand that, support that. I guess the folks that, whose interests are opposed to that, they're pretty good at putting, talking points out there that seem to, I think, muddy the water, so to speak. So let me pivot a little.
Not
Go
to
ahead.
put
Yes.
to find a point on it, but we're talking about real estate.
Yeah.
Regular people in America, as you know well, pay a wealth tax. Right? It's called a homeowner's tax. Right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's not a tax on income.
That's a very good point.
That is
They
a
pay
tax
a
on
tax
wealth.
on their asset.
Absolutely.
So all the regular people that your folks are representing in transactions, they're all
Never
paying
thought
a wealth
about it that way. That's an interesting way
We
to
have a wealth
characterize
tax.
it.
We just have one for regular Joe Schmoes. And we don't have a wealth tax for Elon Musk. So all I'm saying is let's level the playing field.
It's a real estate tax.
And
You're
have a
absolutely right.
wealth tax for all.
And it's substantial. In Texas, it's like 3.5% of the value of your property you have to pay every year.
I mean, it is easily more than a home may appreciate in a given year, right? They're taking a piece of your home every year.
That's
right?
a good point.
But if you make 50 grand, that's okay. If you make 50 million, then it's somehow an intrusion to take a little bit of your wealth. It just makes no sense.
That's a really great point. One of the things, we have this list of tenets of what I call the NARP 10 disciplines, and it's about wealth building. But I want people also to understand what wealth and prosperity actually means versus what the perceptions are that are out there, which are very superficial in my standpoint. I think wealth gives us freedoms. It gives us the opportunity to live the life that we were destined to live. Those are the talking points that I share with our network. But I also talk about giving back. I also talk about the importance of supporting and contributing to people who are less fortunate than themselves. Some people call that philanthropy. So I saw an interview you did with a comedian. It was hilarious. It was all about Batman, where you talked about the fact that you were not a fan of Batman's because of what he represented, which I thought was all in good fun. But your point was something that you talk about in your book. By the way, great book. Thank you for that. Which is sometimes philanthropy is more of a smokescreen than anything else. Talk to us about that.
I think if you look at you asked how we got here, right? If you look at the American social model over the last 40 years, it has been to tell big corporations and very wealthy people to make as much money as possible by cutting every social corner imaginable, but doing the kinds of things that regular folks would never dream of doing. So if you make money for your company by avoiding paying taxes, by setting up all kinds of trusts and whatever, do that. If you can make money by busting unions when working people are trying to come together in solidarity, do that. If you can make money by engaging in wage theft or shifting to dynamic scheduling where working people never have any idea what their day is going to be like tomorrow, today, do that. If you can move production to less regulated, low-wage parts of the world where people are kind of working in serf-like conditions, away from the view of regulators, do that. Cut every moral, ethical corner you can to make as much money as you can. And then do philanthropy. Then turn around and donate some money to some social problems. And I think the problem is what it does, first of all, it serves to justify a system that is kind of indefensible, right? The philanthropy is used to say, see, aren't you glad these great fortunes were developed? Because now they can be given away to this college or this program or this Boys and Girls Club. And it distracts attention from the question of, would the boys and girls in the Boys and Girls Club be so poor if the folks making that money hadn't pushed for those kinds of real estate policies, hadn't pushed for those kinds of regulatory shifts, hadn't pushed for that kind of tax cut that happened? So you have ended up with a society in which people cause problems at the very top, cause social problems on a grand scale, and then convince us that they are the solution to the problem they're still busily causing. And you can look at examples as far afield as Mark Zuckerberg donating $300 million in 2020 to help secure the election, an election that he helped make insecure because he allowed disinformation and Nazi speech to run rampant on Facebook and has resisted every effort to rein it in. So you make the election insecure, and then you donate some of the profits to making it more secure. Or the Sackler family, which promoted Purdue Pharma, which led to this opioid crisis. I'm sure your members in all parts of this country have been affected by the horrific epidemic of opioid overdoses and deaths and pain and addiction around this country. Well, in one of their private group chats that was leaked, they kind of talking about, well, maybe we donate $1 billion to create a foundation to fight addiction. Never thinking maybe we can stop selling the opioids. Never thinking that. Only that we can keep doing what we're doing and give back a little to keep the whole operation flowing.
So you're asking us to be skeptical that obviously giving back and supporting and contributing to people who are less fortunate than ourselves is a good thing, but at the same time, the idea of philanthropy can be misused, and it can be used as a smokescreen to create a divergence from what individuals or companies are actually doing at times, which I think is also a very interesting and compelling point that you make.
And for example, in the arena that you operate in, it is possible to be kind of generous, and if you've done well in this field, and be generous to a local organization. Sure. But we live in a context in which there is a war on Latino people being waged by a very influential political movement in this country that has run the last two elections on kind of smearing Latino communities and other communities.
No doubt.
And there has been an effort, as we were talking about earlier, to shift the economic structure of this country so that the opportunity to buy a home and live that kind of life is going to be, progressively cut down over time. And if in a way you are not working on those root cause issues, you may be donating to the local organization or helping out, but something bigger is happening in the society that you may be missing. And I think a lot of us in this era need to step up and ask, what can I do to look at these problems at the root? Look at the context of what is happening in my community at this deeper level that really affects the opportunity of everyone to live a bountiful life, not just of a handful of kids in my community to get a little extra help.
So this podcast that we're in the middle of right now, I've labeled Govies, Plutes, and Gangsters, right? And it's conversations about closing the wealth gaps in this country, particularly for the Latino community. and you know, I use the title sort of tongue in cheek. You know, there are people who certainly believe, like yourself, that government has to play a big role in addressing this issue. There's other people who think that government is already too big and playing too big a role, and we need to let the free market play its role, and we should be focusing on things like entrepreneurship and so forth. And then you have this third category of folks who don't think about it in either context. They just get up every morning and they do what comes natural to them, and they succeed. And hopefully they bring other people along with them. These are the conversations that I'm having with folks. I think that if we're going to find a way to actually make material progress in this regard, it's probably going to take all three. But you point out to something that I think is undeniable, and that is Latinos have been sort of swept to the side. They have been disparaged as a community. I think that, you know, I have my opinions over, you know, our immediate past president that I've been clear about within my network. I know you've had some thoughts about it as well. But you said something about Donald Trump at one point that I thought was very interesting, and that is the process that got us to Donald Trump actually started 40, 50 years ago with the talking point that government is bad, and culminated in a scenario where we had a president that was fundamentally incompetent at the end of the day. But you saw a connection between all of that. Share some of that with us. I thought it was funny the way you characterized it, but very true.
It's sort of like when you get sick. You know, it may be more comforting to tell yourself that you got sick out of the blue, that some fluke virus hit you or some strange thing happened, and you know, yesterday you were totally healthy and today not. But what often happens when we get sick is that perhaps things were not right in us for some time. Perhaps we were in a state that allowed the recent ailment to capture us. And that may be all kinds of, you know, pre-existing conditions, other ailments we've allowed to go untended, you know, things we couldn't control, immune issues. And I think similarly, there was a temptation to view the coming of Donald Trump as a sudden event that had no precedent and just suddenly kind of caught the United States off guard. And I think that's tempting because it allows us to believe that we were healthy until early November 2016 as a society. I think what Donald Trump did is reveal, Donald Trump's a biopsy of the American body politic. And what he revealed was that we have a media, I'll say this as a media person, that was not up to the task of covering the rise of that kind of white nationalism and backlash, and not up to covering, I think, still threats to democracy. The kind of old rules of both sides coverage and things like that are not really up to that. When one side is trying to not have democracy anymore, how do you cover that? The kind of celebrity culture in media, the clickbait, all of that. He revealed failures in media. I think he revealed that the Republican Party had actually been drifting in a direction of race baiting for a long time. Don't forget Nixon's Southern strategy. Don't forget Reagan's welfare queen. Don't forget, you know, any of a number of policies from the right that were either explicitly or implicitly trying to disenfranchise people of color and others. And so what Trump did was make explicit what had always been implicit in American life. He made the subtext into text. You know, you used to say if you wanted to kind of signal to white voters that you thought Latinos and Black voters and Asian voters didn't deserve public support, you would say something like, let's cut the deficit. And a certain white voter would understand that meant
cutting those programs. Yeah.
Unfavorable people and concentrating resources to favorable people, right? You would just wink and a nod. And that's kind of what Paul Ryan Republicans would do. And what Trump did, in part because he's not particularly bright, is he just eliminated the like game of it, right? That requires a certain IQ to kind of to signal that kind of stuff. And he just ran by declaring war on the Latino community and proposing a Muslim ban, and saying people from Mexico are rapists and this and that. And he just went after it, went for it.
He took what was implied and he explicitly expressed it, and people responded to that. In a big
Millions
way.
of people said, yeah, that. And that's what was so terrifying, because this was clearly in our body politic, right? Like my view is we've been sick for a long time if something like that is possible. And in some ways, it's both a more optimistic and pessimistic point. Pessimistic because the disease is more widespread than one orange guy who's kind of bad, but optimistic in the sense that he's not this singular event that you can now. It's time to go
get rid of him, and the body's healthy all of a sudden.
We have work to do, but it's a kind of guide to what work we have to do. We need a kind of media that can withstand threats to democracy. We need communities in which we can talk to each other. We need, to actually show people that government can make their lives better, because if it doesn't, some guy coming along saying, I'm going to smash and burn it, and me not knowing anything about government is a virtue, that's a kind of logical conclusion. In many ways, he was the logical conclusion of an age that told people that making money and being a business tycoon is the only good life. Government is a menace, and so on and so forth. And I think it's really, really important that we help people understand that if we don't deal with some of these deeper issues, if we don't convince most Americans that it is possible for us to have a better life and for the children a better life, and here's how we do it, then in a way we just are handing people in the country to the demagogues who offer simple, easy, quick, fake solutions that sound very compelling. And it's up to us to actually offer something that feels equally compelling, that is actually democratic and pluralistic and not full of hate.
Well, well, first of all, that was great, and I appreciate that, and I agree with almost everything you just said, because it's absolutely true. And I felt the same way when Trump emerged as a candidate first, and then was equally horrified when he was elected, and have been dumbfounded on how most people, frankly, I don't want to say most people, too many people don't see right through the core of really what he stood for and why he was successful. So kind of pivoting to something else, I'm going to share some data points with you. You may or may not know some of these data points about the Latino community. So Latinos in this country, even though some people are putting the perception out there that Latinos are takers and not contributors to our society, Latinos actually have the highest workforce participation rate in the country. So a higher percentage of our population is in the workforce than any other demographic. Latinos are also driving new business formations, represent more than half of the new businesses that are being formed in the country every year. And in our industry, are driving homeownership growth. Since 2000, 50% of the new homeownership gains in the country have come from the Latino community. And an organization called the Urban Institute did a study last year that estimates over the next 20 years, Latinos will represent 70% of the growth in the homeownership space. So these are data points that you never hear in the media. They're not part of the narrative for the Latino community in general. I think that's maybe partly our fault, but also part of the power structure and powers that be out there. But capitalists are capitalists. Capitalists want to make money. They want to go where the growth is. Why is there so little capital flowing into the Latino marketplaces, even for the most opportunistic and selfish business interests out there? Why is that money not flowing? It seems to make perfect sense to me. It seems to be counter to what capitalism is all about. Is it discrimination? Is it ignorance? Or is it something else? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, what I would say is overall, you have to be aware of the context in which, as you know so well, there is, as I said, a war being waged against the Latino community and identities, from not from a fringe movement, but increasingly from a movement that represents, half of the political establishment of this country. And I think there is a puzzle there where, in spite of that war being waged, a non-trivial fraction of Latinos actually voted for that movement. And that's an intra-family conversation that needs to happen, but I think there's some reflection even there. What is it about? I think particularly for that sort of entrepreneurial community, there is some kind of appeal that the Trumpist thing has, in the sense of independence and the sense of take your destiny back. And I think we need to do better organizing to think about how to counter that message, because it's particularly distressing when folks who are, being targeted by a political movement, feel drawn to it. That feels like, my new book's called The Persuaders. That feels like a persuasion challenge that we need to deal with. But look, I think there is right now a war for the core American identity, and Latinos are only part of a broader reshaping of identity that is happening right now. This is becoming a majority minority country, and it is becoming something that has really not ever existed in the history of the world. A major power in the world that does not have an ethnic core, it does not have a majority, does not have a central religion. With all due respect to every other place, I mean, even Canada, which has a lot of diversity, Canada is not, if you actually look at the numbers, Canada has very few cities that are majority minority. We have more than a dozen major cities that are majority minority, right? You go to Europe, I mean, they all have immigrants, but like no country in Europe is on track to be a majority minority country. You go to India and China, I mean, these are just not nations of immigrants. Nigeria, so they're just not in the same policy.
So there's resistance to that, I guess, is what
correct. And that's fine. I'm not saying that those models are bad, but we are attempting something very hard. And a lot of what we're seeing right now is resistance, as you say, to that onrushing future. But it's worth remembering that there is resistance because something good is actually happening. Something good is being attempted. We are attempting to build a kind of country that is new in history, that is forged of the world, forged of people from all the world. And when you are out there representing folks in the Latino community trying to do better by their families and by their communities, what they are engaged in is also a political act. They are engaged one by one in trying to show that there's no one who can't be an American. And that is sadly a bold political statement in a moment of backlash, but they are part of building the kind of next America, which I think is going to be something that dazzles the world.
It should be very, absolutely. We're gonna one thing for sure is we're going to have better music, we're going to have better food, and we're going to be better looking as a country as that comes about. So let me just kind of.
I often think about this example, like I'm sure a lot of folks listening to this podcast would know this, but salsa music was not invented in Central America or South America. It was invented in New York City, right? It was not invented by other folks. It was invented by Latinos in New York City. But why in New York City? How come they didn't invent it in Colombia? How come they didn't invent it in Argentina, right? It was the different communities, different Latino communities, right? Afro-Latino communities, European, that were in New York City, right? And collided and brought, someone's drum tradition and someone's guitar tradition, right? And sorry, rest of the world, but there's not a lot of places in the world where all those Latino communities, all those traditions live in the same place, bump into each other, right? So, and that's salsa is one example of so many things that have happened. I mean, jazz, was a earlier example of the same tradition in New Orleans. We have the opportunity to create many such things like that. We have created many such things like that. There's a reason that American culture, even in this era, continues to be the envy of the world. It is because it is made of the world. It resonates around the world because, the smartest Brazilians in the world work in the United States. Not always, but often, right?
Yeah.
The best Chinese physicists, are in the United States. At our best, we are the place where the best, smartest, most compassionate, interesting people on earth come to do things they couldn't do elsewhere. That's at least the dream and the hope. And I think if we can remember that, we can get past and defeat the backlash that wants to tell a kind of undemocratic few that they can that they can break the country instead of share it.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's fantastic. Completely agree, and it's nice to sort of end on some high notes out there, because I do think that the future can be what we make of it, and it can be a lot better than what we've experienced recently. I certainly would love to see that. I've got a lot of reasons to believe in that. Let me just close by asking a couple things. First of all, thank you again for joining me today and for joining us in September. I think the thoughts that you put out there are extremely important and compelling. So put yourself in my shoes for a minute, right? So you lead the largest Latino business organization in the country. Your words matter to them. What would you say to our members? And what would you do as an organization, as an advocacy group? Two different things, but maybe similar.
I would say that real estate is a symptom of a certain kind of life lived in a certain kind of way. It is reflective of family and whether people, first of all, feel they can form family, have enough stability, feel they can form a family.
Yeah.
It is in a place to put the family that you feel you can form. There are questions about whether people are perpetual renters and suffering evictions, or whether they're people who can live the American dream of owning a home, etc. If you work in real estate the way your community does, you are profoundly implicated, like it or not, in the question of whether this is going to be a country that works for all or works for the few. And although you may not have felt it yet because the times have been good, this country is trending in a direction where the winners are taking it all, and things like homeownership are going to be a relic of the past for many Americans, something their parents and grandparents did, but something they never do. And so I think it's really worth thinking about, how do you fight at that systemic level, at that policy level, for an American dream that is widely distributed, for the chance to form families, put real estate over their heads, retire somewhere beautiful and stable. How do you rebuild the opportunity to live those dreams? Because if you're just going about the grind of your work, and in the background, the dream is being stolen, at some point you're going to wake up and realize, I'm doing a thing that is no longer a thing. And that is very much the direction the country is going in. And I think there's an opportunity to fight back and say, the dream of mass home ownership, the dream of people being able to form families, invest in real estate, have something, a nest egg to enjoy in retirement, that's a dream worth defending. It's a dream under threat, and it's a dream we can get back.
So Anand, thank you for that. Thank you for joining me here today once again. I do think that you give us a lot to think about. I really admire the fact that you are a deep thinker, and we just don't do enough of that. Everything that we do in terms of the way we acquire information, the way we share information, is in sound bites. It's just superficial. There aren't enough deep thinkers out there looking beyond the superficial and looking at what's underneath the hood, and what really is going to matter in our society moving forward. And you're one of the people who's doing that. So really, really appreciate your time today. Look forward to meeting you in person in September. Good luck, buddy.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person.
Same here. Take care.